Sustainability, ESG, responsible business. Buzzwords, restricted terms, or benchmarks for organisational success. At Impact, we believe that business is one of the most powerful global forces for shaping, influencing, and catalysing change. But how do you build purpose-led organisations that positively impact people, planet, and prosperity? And what does this mean in practice for leaders? How do you move beyond tick box compliance to embed sustainability into strategy, culture, and decision-making? And why is this shift essential for long-term success? To help us unpack how organisations can turn ambition into action, I'm joined by Sian Modine. I've got questions on sustainability, nature, human rights, and the future of leadership. So let's not waste any time and get straight into it. Sian, welcome to In Good Company. How are you today?
I am good, thank you. And how are you?
I'm very well, thank you for asking. It's very nice to have you here, and thank you for giving us your time today. Let's give our audience the chance to get to know you a little bit better. So we ask the same question of every guest at the beginning of each episode, which is to tell us about yourself in 60 seconds.
Okay, I don't think I'll take 60 seconds. So I've been in learning and development pretty much all my career. I'm a learning designer, a facilitator, a coach. And for the last 20 years, which is a long time really, it's a bit scary how long, I've had a focus around sustainability in terms of leadership and training. So I first worked with Impact in 2007, and I was based out in Thailand, which was an amazing experience. And since then, I've worked with lots of different organisations looking at sustainability and integrating that into training and development programs. So yeah, that's my career. I live in a village in the southwest of England where today it is very rainy, which is quite normal. Yes,
well, it's the same up here, I'm afraid to say, in the northwest of England. So yes, it's a wet day all around. But let's not let that ruin our experience today.
Okay.
So fortunately, it's dry inside, is what I mean. So yes, we're talking a lot about sustainability today, and the kind of and sort of the broad nature that covers. And you've already alluded to the fact that you've got a breadth of experience that we're very keen to dive in and extract from you today. So, as you mentioned, you've been working with organisations and leadership development around sustainability challenges for around 20 years. I'm sure in that time, lots has changed, but has the business case for sustainability changed? And what's in, what's out, what's moved forward?
Okay, that's a big question. It has moved, of course. In the last 20 years, it's like moved a massive amount. Thank goodness. 20 years ago, people didn't really understand what climate change was, or global heating, whatever they called it. 20 years ago, and I remember. When I was working out in Thailand, speaking to a hotel manager there about what their sustainability policy was. And he just laughed at me, said, "Oh, you're a tree hugger, go away." So, okay, I don't think that would happen now. So I think in terms of like mainstream sustainability, it's moved forward. It's moved forward a lot. Most big corporations have got sustainability departments. In the last few years, we're seeing more chief sustainability officers. So you're having sustainability at the exec level of organisations. Legislation's increasing around sustainability reporting. Investors, asking a lot more questions around long-term sustainability of business. So I think the business case definitely has moved in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
However,
yes, there's always however. I was just reminded me of another conversation we had on this podcast with Simon Hensel Thomas from IKEA, who's I forget the exact wording of his role now, but I think he was similar to Chief Sustainability Officer, and saying how their business was using 2% of the world's wood, which doesn't sound like a massive percentage, but when you consider how much wood that actually is, it's incredible. So the fact that businesses like that have got people in place to make sure that they're practicing sustainability is super important. Sorry, I totally interrupted you there with a tangent, but yes,
fine.
continue. What's in, what's not changed? What's the however moment?
The however is what is going on right now. I think so 2025 and now into 2026 has just been really, really strange. So, I think I saw just a general increase in sustainability action and activity over the last, let's say, 10 years or so.
Yeah.
But last year, two major things, I think two major things happened. First was Donald Trump came to power, that's the word. And the second was there was there was a pause on some EU legislation that was going to come into play. So I don't think I need to talk about Donald Trump and where we are now. It's January 2026 now. Let's see what happens. I think that's well known, his impact on sustainability and climate and so on, and diversity and inclusion. But just in terms of the EU law, I think that's quite interesting, because there was it was called the CSDDD, and there's lots and lots of acronyms in the world of sustainability. But it's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. That was due to come into force, and then it was paused last year because there were, for many different reasons, there was something called the Omnibus that was looking at, is it already covered by other laws? Is it taxonomy, etc.? But the impact of that, I think, was that a lot of our big companies had been gearing up their sustainability departments to get ready for the changes that it was going to need and the requirements it was going to put on them. And so that all sort of got paused. And so that the business case for sustainability, which I think was your question, is this year, it still seems quite uncertain. It feels like it's been paused. And if you can probably read about the ESG backlash that's happening, that's what it's been called last year. And there's a new phenomenon which I've come across recently called green hushing. So you might have heard of greenwashing in the past, but now it's green hushing. So companies that, I understand, are carrying on with what they need to do around sustainability and are keeping up with their ambitions and their targets and their progress, but they're just not talking about it so much. And so that's difficult to see what's going on. As an outsider looking into a business, what's happening.
Yeah. Those are both terms that I hadn't come across yet. So I'm pleased that you've voiced them today, because it will give us something to look into further after this recording. So yeah, I'm fascinated to learn more about that. And it was also interesting, of course. Yeah, the what goes on politically is a massive influence on what organisations do and don't do when it comes to sustainability and many other things, in how they operate, and that's forever changing. And I think that's going to be a constant thing that organisations are going to have to navigate. Yeah. I guess another part of it is that it's the sort of internal engagement when it comes to doing new initiatives. So, we chatted before this recording. We talked about how hard it is to people for how hard it is for people to engage if they don't have like an emotional or logical connection to a cause. Yeah. So with so many targets and goals that organizations already have in place, what will truly make the biggest difference in driving sustainability initiatives? Is it policy, business, leadership, or individual action?
Yeah, you're right. With politics has a big impact, and that, therefore I think because of the changes that we've seen recently in the last 12 months with the US, and even in the UK, the Conservative government are saying that if they come back into the power, then they will go back on the Climate Change Act commitments, that have been in place since 2008. So I think, policy is important and it's needed to create those frameworks. And there's lots of good policy that has been put in place around sustainability. But I think for me, it is really business leadership is the thing that will drive it through. Because business leaders can act in spite of what's happening in policy, even though, like now, maybe they're just keeping a little bit quiet about it. I think the CEO of Nestle was saying, we're still doing what we want to do, but we're just not talking about it anymore because it's not politically, a good idea to talk about it. Yeah. So I think it has to be business leadership because it's there for the long term.
And so, yeah, you brought up Nestle as an example there. Like, have there any other? Have you got more to add to that story? Could you, because for those that aren't familiar, including myself, as it turns out.
Okay. No, I mean, that was just something I read recently in the Financial Times, I think, was saying that, along with this green hushing concept, that, we're still committed to our targets, that they're admittedly behind their targets, but they're still committed to their targets of net zero by 2050. But they're just not good. It's not going to be a big marketing force. We've seen over the past, recent years, people pushing the sustainability agenda in terms of a marketing initiative, and that's where some of it's got into greenwashing. But I think companies have been a little bit more quiet and beneath the radar about it now.
Yeah, it feels like there's no real right answer to what and that whole thing of like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Like,
I know.
So it's it's a tricky one, I guess, to navigate there as well. But it also, it made us, and we talked about it in the intro about, often it comes to people. We talked about a little bit about politics. I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but
no, please don't.
No, because of course well, and also it does change. So it does change so often, but
hopefully,
whether for good or not. But it often comes down to non-government to take the biggest action. When it comes to and often not necessarily, and also within organisations, not necessarily. We talk at Impact about acts of leadership, and we often say that leadership can and should come from anywhere within an organisation. So it could be that, when it comes to a sustainability initiative, that might be coming from somewhere in a traditional hierarchy lower down within an organisation, where something could be noticed, change could be implemented, and then that can expand out of sphere. And I think that if organisations can provide that. Space for people to feel like they can create their own initiatives that are for the benefit of, as we again mentioned in the intro, the 3 Ps: planet, people, and prosperity. Then I think that can only be a good thing.
I think that's the key. Is like for it to really work, it needs to become part of business as usual, and and that's where embedding sustainability in decision making, day to day, actions. That's where it happens, and maybe that happens. That has to be inspired by leaders at the top, maybe, or it can happen at any level of the organisation. But for me, it's about that embedding it into the day to day, so it's seen as part of business as usual. I think that's the absolute key to it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it makes that change feel less difficult, I guess, if it's like you say, when it becomes part of the everyday.
Yeah.
It kind of filters out gradually, as it were. Then it feels less like it's being done to, and the change is being done with. Just briefly, let's expand on what we mean by sustainability, because as we may or may not know, it's not just about the environment. Yet often people think about sustainability just about the environment. So maybe if you could expand on, how you would define sustainability when it's not just about the environment.
Yeah, I mean, the word sustainability, some people like it, some people don't like it. I don't like to get hung up on the language, really. But for me, it's looking at the social side of business. It's looking at the environmental side of business. It's looking at the sustainability of the business in terms of its ongoing profit and resilience. And I think the word sustainability it's controversial, and I think there's one other thing that you're sort of seeing at the moment. It's like the language of sustainability is almost being rewritten into the business language of risk management and resilience. But for me, it definitely covers the environmental side of things and the people side of things, as well as the business profitability in a business context. It has to be all of those elements.
So focusing in on you mentioned human there, and we again, as part of our sort of research call, we talked about human rights. Why should human rights be a core of sustainability leadership, and how have you seen this done well?
Yeah, Good question. I mean, it has to be a core of sustainability. Sustainability is about people, planet, and profit, whichever words you want to use, and it has to be, a core part of that. And I think even in the question, it's sort of it shows the type of mindset that we have, that we think of these things as separate, and I think that's at the root of the problem. Like, the world is messy and complex, and it's not very clearly delineated into different sections. And as human beings, we try to create that order. So often in our organizations, we have silos. So even within sustainability departments, you still have the human rights team, and you have the social impact team, and you have the environmental team, and then you have the climate team. So even within our sustainability world, it's quite fragmented. So I think we need to focus more around the interconnection between all of these things. We're looking at human rights and environmental due diligence. It's combined, and I think that's what's quite interesting. Is there's some interesting work being done looking at those intersections of those things, and saying, well, actually, we have to look at people and environment and nature, in at the same time, because they're intrinsically linked. So yeah, I'm just listening to an Audible book by Tony Juniper, who's the chair of Natural England, and it's called Just Earth. And he puts a really good point of view about saying that the major obstacle to environmental action is inequality. So throughout this book, he links inequality from a people perspective through to environmental impact. And so, I think we'll be seeing more of that interconnection playing out, over the coming years, because it has to be, because it's linked so intrinsically.
Definitely.
What was the question?
Well, the question was around, like, why should it be a core part of sustainability leadership? And you've articulated brilliantly. I suppose the secondary part of that question was, how have you seen it done well?
Okay.
But before you just quickly move on to that, just remind me the name of that author?
Tony Juniper.
Tony Juniper. First of all, what a great name! What's a great surname for that? And as it happens, and that interconnected nature of humans and nature, I found myself yearning for spending more time in the outdoors and being, as you've just said. And just the weekend just gone, I found myself in a woodlands planting a tree with permission. Okay. And it was a juniper tree. So how things have just connected. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're going to have to read the book.
Absolutely. I will have to buy it on immediately. But and that was with my 5-year-old, and I found myself, again, more recently, and I suppose since having children, is making sure that my kids are as connected with nature as they possibly can be. So one of the things, as I mentioned, is doing that. So I will be getting that book, and I will try and find time amongst putting them, looking after, bringing up those children to read it.
Planting trees.
So yes, moving back to our question, which is, in terms of this, where and how have you seen it done well?
I mean, in terms of human rights, there's lots and lots of great work being done in human rights, and one of the organisations I work with is Human Rights Consultancy, and again, working with lots of multinationals, so similar clients to I know that you have at Impact. And I think the best work is where it's been embedded, as we're saying, into organisations' processes and systems. I think the supply chain is a real issue around human rights and transparency in supply chain, because we have huge companies with huge supply chains, and it's really hard to understand what the human rights impacts are further down the supply chain. So I've seen companies working with suppliers a lot. So the big companies working with their suppliers to say, this is what we expect around human rights. Where are the risks? How can we help you to make sure that human rights, is a human rights culture in your organization. I've done a lot of training and e-learning, for example, around human rights, to just generally raise awareness of what human rights issues are in organizations, and try to help people to say, well, how does that actually relate to me, and how does that relate to my role, and what can I do? How can I keep my eye out to see what's happening around human rights? And if I see something that doesn't look right or feel right, what can I do? So really trying to make that more of a common attitude and approach within organisations to really to really think about the human rights, both in your own operations and where you're working, but also in the supply chain. And it's complicated, of course.
Yeah, and it goes back to what I kind of briefly mentioned earlier about that, the acts of leadership, and I didn't really go into a huge level of detail, but that is our leadership model stems around noticing, deciding, and acting. Yeah. And that is exactly what you've just talked about there with supply chain. If there is something that doesn't feel right, and that there is something that you can do about it, wherever you sit within that, then it should be, organizations should provide that environment in which that you can act on that, I suppose.
Absolutely.
And not be criticized, or if you're doing it for the right reasons, then not be penalized for it.
And there's a lot sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No, please.
I would say there's a lot of work that's done on technical term grievance mechanisms, but that I've just been doing some training around that, and really making sure that if you set up a process whereby somebody can report something they think is not quite right, how are they protected? How is it anonymous? And what happens as a result of that, so there isn't retaliation as such. So there's a lot of work being done on human rights, and it's becoming more mainstream, I would say, but it's still very much focused on find where the highest risks are, because there's so much to look at. So companies often look at where is the highest risk, and what can they do there, and so they're starting at those areas and then moving that across their organizations.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Briefly to kind of move us back into into more specifically the environment, but possibly this again is that intersection. But my next question is around nature-based solutions. I understand that they're gaining more traction and focus. And by that, perhaps if the examples I've got are things like reforestation, wetlands management, that kind of thing. Perhaps you've got some other examples, but beyond climate change, how do you see these shaping corporate leadership in the sort of next 5-10 years?
I'd love to see them shaping corporate leadership a lot, because I think it's one of the areas that hasn't really had so much attention paid to it. Most organizations now have, energy efficiency, renewables, waste reduction in their strategies. That's part of business. And I think this nature's like the sort of frontier, if you like, for businesses. Interestingly, the World Economic Forum do a risk report, and the second highest risk over the next 10 years is biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. So number 2 out of all the risks of the world. If you look at the next year, it's more about geopolitical issues and so on, but looking 10 years ahead. So it's definitely on the radar. People know that it's there, and nature is so intrinsic to business. And I think that's the shift that needs to happen. I think when finance and legislation start to get behind it, that will make a difference. And there's something called, you ready for another acronym?
Always.
TNFD. I get that confused. Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So what that's doing is looking at nature and finance, and looking at how to disclose the relationship between those, basically. And they have a framework in place to help organizations assess where they're dependent on nature and where they have an impact on nature. And so that work has to happen more and more as we go through. And I think that's where it's so I'm quite technical on this, and that's where it comes back into the sort of risk management. So if you think about organizations that are so dependent on nature, whether it's like food, or agriculture, or IKEA timber that you mentioned earlier, looking at their risks around water, about soil erosion, for crops, around pollination and what's happening around collapse of bees. I think there's in California, they've got issues around where I think most of the world's almonds are farmed, apparently, in California. Right. And because of the decline in the bee population, it's increasing their production costs. because they're having to find other ways to pollinate by robots or whatever it might be. And so I think,
of course, water's a massive one at the moment, particularly with and even more so in the past couple of years because of the massive rise in AI and the amount of water that uses in order to operate the data centers and so on. And again, just to pick up on something else, I still find it mind-boggling that people don't regard themselves as being part of nature. No. It's fascinating. Maybe it's easier for me living, I suppose, closer to the countryside and seeing environmental changes, being a sort of a victim of flooding and being more hyper aware of it as well. But yeah, I just find it baffling that people find being a person and nature as separate. It's bizarre.
But that's the predominant view, and for most, so many people who don't live in places like you live and I live and have that, even we're protected, we're very much protected from it, and so it, and that's another whole language thing in sustainability world about nature and people. Well, it's the same thing, but you have to. It has to make sense to people to talk about it. If we all started talking about us as nature, then it'd probably turn off the business leaders and be a bit too woo-woo. So but it's interesting for sure. Yeah,
no, it's true. So moving on then. So my next question is around again, we talked about another acronym, which we've mentioned already, ESG, and organizations typically will have teams responsible for it. How, in your words, what tips do you have around how can every leader see sustainability as a leadership challenge and not a side project? What role, for example, what part can L&D and HR play in this to help drive that?
Yeah, I think this is it's obviously at the heart of the work that I do, because it has to become part of it, as we said earlier. It has to be embedded. It has to be part of everybody's day-to-day job. But with everything else that's going on and the targets and goals and shifting priorities, you can understand why, if it's not something that people naturally feel that passionate about, that they won't pay attention to it. And if then they don't have to, then they won't. So I think it's about how we can, through learning and development, how can we make it so that we help people to think, well, what is it that you do? So one way is looking at it to say, well, this is an issue. This is a sustainability issue that affects the organisation, or this is a human rights issue. And getting every leader to think, well, how is it that work you do? How is your work dependent on this resource or these people? How does the work that you do impact other people or the planet? And then what can you do in terms of your business and decision making to integrate the consideration for this into what you do? So somehow it's trying to not put it as an initiative or something separate from what they do, but how does it intrinsically fit into what you're doing to make your business better and also make it better in terms of resources and people. And I think it's about how to get it into decision making at all levels. So I think that's the challenge, is to make it relevant to them day to day. So it's not just seen as the ESG department over here, it's part of what everybody does. And that's sort of more obvious for some leaders and some functions than others, I guess.
It's, is there any merit in sort of starting small? So, we're talking about like, making it part of the everyday. Is there any merit in sort of, even with small initiatives, I think this is a very specific example. So,
okay, go for it.
But I think to our communal kitchen in this office building, and we now have, and we have had for some time, a compost bin on the top of the kitchen counter, which, up until probably a year ago, we didn't have, for a worm farm. So that it gets emptied out into a worm farm. Something that one person probably thought of within the company and said, could we have this to make a worm farm? And somebody went, yes. So, and that then is kind of, even just that small action then gets you going. So that's where I'm going with this almost a metaphor is, to have a small, and this is, potentially a very small, but you mentioned about the bees. Is there, are there benefits and merits to starting with really small initiatives for it to then expand out to make our thinking, it just become natural as part of everyday thinking about issues such as what we've been discussing?
Yeah, I think absolutely. There's definitely the opportunity for so much, because so much needs to be done. So whether it's small examples like the worm farm here, and that becomes the norm, and then people think, well, how can we relate what we've done here to that, and maybe and so it sort of spreads out. Absolutely. I'm not sure how much impact that will have, because the scale of what needs to be done is so huge. So I really think that leaders towards the top of organizations, middle of organizations, really need to say, well, how do we actually change what we're doing in our business so that it is sustainable? And for me, it's, I suppose almost
that's what I was getting at, was that it's not necessarily, we often think of these initiatives should come from top down.
Yeah.
Whereas that, I would argue that shouldn't, well, in many cases can't always be the case, in that, certain ideas can come from elsewhere in the business. It's creating that, like I said before, that environment to enable the conversations to take place that enable that change for the bigger scale stuff. Yeah.
And I think those questions are like, what do I do and how does it impact people and the environment, and what can I do to maximize the positive impact, minimize the negative impact? If everybody could think about that. And it's almost like, to me, the old days where you had quality management. This is before your time.
Possibly.
It was a long time ago. You used to have quality management. So you'd have a production process, the project would go through the process, and at the end, people would do a quality check on it.
Yeah.
And then we had, total quality management came in, and quality was embedded at every stage of the process. And so, you didn't need the quality team as such anymore, because everybody was looking at quality. And for me, that's what needs to happen with sustainability. At the moment, we've still got, sustainability teams doing the work, going out, doing assessments, talking to people, doing the work at the end of a process, or separate from the process. Whereas what we need to look at is like, how do we integrate it to everybody's work so that everybody is focused?
And have you got any sort of, if you could wave a magic wand, have you got any, or even just like, whenever you're going into organizations, like what's the one thing you kind of leave people with to kind of start or maybe this is the stuff that you sell, so maybe you don't want to give it away from, you know what I mean? Like what's the like the sort of golden nugget, if you've got one, to say, right, well, this is how you can start tomorrow to make change happen?
Well, I think that's sort of coming back to learning and development, and what's the role of learning and development. I don't believe that we should run a training program. I don't know if this is practical. I don't believe we should have a leadership program, for sure, that doesn't have sustainability embedded in it. So similar to what I'm saying for leaders to do, that's what I would do with my programs. And sometimes, because if people aren't aware of something, they can't understand it, they can't engage with it, and therefore they can't act on it. And so I think our learning development programs are just absolutely, crucial, because that's where people can go and have a different perspective and have a look at things differently, and whole experiential learning, impacts model, which I absolutely love. That, the more that you can immerse people in these issues and complexities and get them to feel it and understand it logically, but also connect with it, emotionally, then I think learning development I think it's the key to it. And even if sustainability is sort of like snuck in by stealth, which I've done with Impact in the past, we did years ago, we did an influencing skills program. So it wasn't about sustainability, it was about influencing. But we integrated a simulation in that, which was about sustainable paper and packaging for this organization. We brought actors in. So the participants in the program were really immersed in having to make a decision on which supplier, I think it was, they were going to go for. And all of the scenario was based on a real situation that had occurred. So they practiced their influencing. We had actors, they were immersed in it. They really grappled with the dilemmas that were there. They made their decisions. They presented to a senior leader, who then told them, oh, great, this is and this is what actually happened in our business. So they could see it was relevant. So I think stealth sometimes works, especially I guess maybe now, as we're saying, with this green hushing going on. People might not want to give their budgets to a sustainability training program, but we should just be having it in everything. That's what I do.
Yeah. So. Well, and again, there's no, there's, as we are human beings on a planet that we live on, whether we're still talking about the environment in which we all coexist. So yeah, it is reality, isn't it? Just to pick back on that story that you were just sharing. What was the? So you mentioned that although it wasn't a direct objective of the program, it was still talked about, and you mentioned that there was change. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit? There was a change that did occur.
Well, I think that the change that occurred was that the change that occurred was that the senior leader who had been actually involved in this business decision it was based on, came in and said, okay, we've taken your examples and your recommendations, and they had a conversation about those so people could see, and this is this is what we actually did. And I think for me, where the change occurs is like the vital part of any of these programs is like, well, so what? How does that relate to you in your role? Because, not everybody's responsible for sourcing packaging, but the principles are the same. So how does what we've discussed here, how does that apply to you in your role and what you do day to day? Where are there similarities? What can you learn from that? And what could you put into place that would replicate this situation?
Yeah. And what you've done there is neatly circle back to what we talked about right at the top of this episode. So thank you for that.
That's all right.
And I will bring us to a close. But before we do let you go, I want to just thank you again for providing just what I feel like is even just scratching the surface of this. And I could talk to you for probably hours longer than what we've got time for today. But yes, thank you ever so much for giving us your time today. My final question to you before I do let you go is the same question that we ask all of our guests on this podcast, which is, and you've probably heard or maybe even asked this question before, if you were starting your career again, if you had the opportunity to talk to your younger self, your 18-year-old self, what would be the one piece of advice you would give yourself?
Yeah. I thought about this question.
It's
a hard one
to
answer. No, I mean, for me, I'm sure other people have said this as well. For me, it's like trust your gut, trust your instincts. If it feels good, do it. If it doesn't feel good, don't do it. I've learned that through trial and error. That when I've said yes or no to things that didn't feel right, then it wasn't right. And then when I thought, this feels right, this is good, this is what I need to do, then do it.
Yeah.
So I mean,
I sometimes challenge back, and I will do it today, which is do you think you live by that advice now?
Generally, yes, I do. I mean, as I said, 20, 25, 26, a little bit different. So I'm holding on to that. But I'm sticking to that, living to my advice. Is it feel like the right thing to do? Is it where your interest and your passion lies? Yes, well, stick with it and go for it. So ask me in 6 months' time. See if I've gone back on it.
Hopefully you trusted your gut when it came to saying yes to agreeing to being on this podcast. So
actually,
by virtue of the fact that you're here.
Exactly.
Well, that's been great, and as I say, thank you ever so much for giving us your time today. It's been a great conversation, and as I say, I'd love to find out more from you. So that just leaves me to say that if you would like to find anything more about the work that Impact does or the work that Sian does, then you can find all of the links that you need in the episode description of where you found today's podcast. So thank you one final time to Sian for joining me today. Thank you, Sian.
Thank you.
And until the next time, take care.